Trump's victory in the 2024 presidential election has thrown the future of Ukraine into uncertainty. Throughout his campaign, Trump infamously repeated that he would end the war between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours. Many other comments by Trump and the people in his inner circle seem to indicate a growing desire to withhold U.S. military aid to Ukraine unless the Ukrainians negotiate an end to the war with Russia, in a deal that could potentially see Ukraine ceding territory to Russia. So, is Ukraine screwed? Will Trump force Ukraine to give up any attempts to liberate Russian-occupied territory? Will Trump be able to bring Russia to the negotiation table? Can Trump even end the war at all? These are all questions we will answer in this video. We will look at 5 possible scenarios for Ukraine's future and how the war could end in Trump's second term, starting from least to most likely. Number 1. Total Ukrainian collapse. I actually think this scenario is the least likely of all possibilities for Ukraine. In this scenario, Ukrainian defenses on the front line would collapse, and Russia would subsequently sweep through and occupy much of Ukraine. The government in Kiev would cease to exist. Putin would then be free to do almost whatever he wants with Ukraine. He'd most likely annex eastern half of the country into Russia, convert central Ukraine to a Russian puppet state, and then offer up western Ukraine's territory to whichever country wants it, as he claimed he'd do. Now, other than maybe Hungary and Belarus, no European country would go through with Putin's plan to partition western Ukraine, so it would likely still remain a part of the Russian puppet state. There are several reasons why I think this scenario is extremely unlikely. First of all, if Russia overruns Ukraine's defenses, I think that it is very likely that Ukraine would seek to rapidly develop nukes, as Zelensky told Trump he'd do when they met a few months ago. Second, a total Ukrainian collapse would be a complete humiliation for Trump. It would make the fall of Afghanistan look like a footnote in American history. Despite all the rumbling from Trump and his team that Ukraine is fleecing the US out of taxpayer dollars, I'm confident that they won't allow a complete Ukrainian defeat. Trump has picked Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, making the senator from Florida the nation's top diplomat. Being a Floridian, I can probably tell you at least a few things about Marco Rubio that many Americans don't know. Most relevant to this video is that he has for years taught classes about international relations and current events at Florida International University. Based on what I've heard from people who took his class, Rubio presents a surprisingly nuanced analysis of the foreign policy issues that America faces. This is somewhat reassuring to me, because that means we're going to have a Secretary of State who at least understands the value of NATO and protecting Ukraine, even if he may not publicly express this in order not to irk Trump. Rubio has for a long time paid close attention to the conflict in Ukraine, more so than most other politicians in Washington. You may recall at the beginning of the invasion, Rubio was the first source to reveal that Russian paratroopers had landed at Hostomel Airport in Kiev. Obviously, Rubio's Secretary of State still isn't the best for Ukraine, but for God's sake, guys, it's a second Trump administration. This is probably the best Ukraine is going to get. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying Rubio will be the voice pressuring Trump to give Ukraine what it needs to defeat Russia. I'm saying Rubio will be the voice pressing Trump not to allow Ukraine to be wiped out by Russia. He has indicated that he believes Russia is a short-term threat to the US, and that since the war is stalemated, Ukraine's best option is to negotiate rather than fight on. So, Rubio will hopefully be the one in the Situation Room encouraging Trump to be relatively more hawkish in Russia. We all know that people who disagree with Trump don't last long, but if Trump is really intent on bringing the war to an end quickly, Rubio should be there long enough to have a major impact. There's also Mike Waltz, who Trump appointed as National Security Policy Advisor, who suggested that Trump should collapse the Russian economy if Putin doesn't negotiate. But, elephant in the room, Trump did appoint Tulsi Gabbard, who is known for expressing really pro-Russia views, as Director of National Intelligence. That is a pretty horrible pick for Ukraine, but I don't think she will have enough influence to allow a total Ukrainian collapse to happen. Elon Musk, who has espoused views sympathetic to Russia for years, is also apparently going to have a major influence in the Trump administration, which is also bad for Ukraine. Now, if this scenario were to unfold, we would see drastic consequences for world history. An emboldened Russia would ramp up its hybrid war against Europe, attacking critical infrastructure, and maybe even launching future invasions of nearby countries, such as Moldova, Georgia, or even Kazakhstan. These 3 countries all have significant Russian populations, and have defied Putin in some way in the past few years, making them possible targets. A weakened West would be further tested by Russia, who may test the limits of the West's reluctance to defend itself. For example, Russia could seize a border village in the Baltics, just to see if NATO would respond, and risk starting a major war over an insignificant border village, or refuse to respond, and effectively cease to exist as an effective defensive alliance. Most worryingly, China will see Russia's victory and the West's lack of response, and be further emboldened to invade Taiwan. In such a scenario, I also see North Korea invading South Korea at the same time. with both China and North Korea believing that a coordinated attack wouldn't see a strong response from an increasingly isolationist United States. All of this will be pushing the world far closer to World War III. Number 2. Decisive Ukrainian victory. This scenario is extremely unlikely for what I think are obvious reasons. In my opinion, a decisive Ukrainian victory would entail Ukraine not only halting the current Russian advance in eastern Ukraine, but also liberating a strategically significant chunk of Russian-occupied territory. This doesn't mean pushing back the front line a few miles. This means seizing a vast enough swath of territory that Russia views itself as defeated, and so that even if the front lines are frozen with Russia gaining land, Russia is put in a severely disadvantageous position. To me, this mostly means Ukraine breaking the land bridge between Russia and Crimea by liberating the Russian-occupied portions of Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. Now, I think this whole scenario is super unlikely for a few reasons. Number 1, this is all contingent on the US continuing to provide a massive level of military aid that not only keeps up with the Biden administration provided, but goes above and beyond that. This means the whole West significantly increasing its production of artillery shells and sending regular shipments of modern tanks, jets, missiles, and ammunition. It's impossible to imagine a Republican-controlled House and Senate, let alone a Trump administration, being willing to provide that level of aid, even if Putin refused Trump's offer to negotiate. We know several Trump insiders suggested continuing aid to Ukraine if Putin rejected Trump's diplomatic overtures, but it's hard to see how Ukraine could achieve a decisive victory with the current level of aid. And a decisive victory would require aid to be ramped up, which again, it's hard to see Republicans doing. Don't get me wrong, the US could easily afford it, and would absolutely be worth the cost, but I just don't see Republicans doing it after spending months rambling about how Ukraine was being given too much aid and was about to cause World War III. Some of you may say, wait, rip Lincoln. What if Europe wakes up and provides this aid? Now, as much as I would like that to happen, let's be real here. Russia is an existential threat to European security, and yet, European nations like Germany still debate if they should do what America just did, which is the bare minimum, which is giving Ukraine the right to conduct long-range missile strikes into Russia using Western weapons. We are years into this war. If the Europeans are going to start taking their security seriously and ramping up military aid to Ukraine in large enough numbers for Ukraine to win, they would have done it by now. Now, I don't think Europe eventually waking up to the Russian threat is 100% off the table. I just think that when it does happen, it will be too late to ensure a decisive Ukrainian victory. It honestly may even happen after the war ends. Now, if this best case scenario were to happen, and Ukraine does achieve a decisive victory, it would send a huge signal to the world that the West will defend itself and respond aggressively when provoked. Russia would undergo severe instability, but I doubt regime change would occur. Iran, China, and North Korea all would be significantly deterred from launching attacks on their neighbors. World War III becomes a lot less likely. Number 3. Negotiated end. In this scenario, Trump successfully brings both Putin and Zelensky to negotiate. I rate this as somewhat likely. There's a real possibility this does happen, and it's not difficult to conceive like the previous two scenarios. In this world, Trump does what national security advisors in his orbit said he would do, and threaten both Ukraine and Russia in order to get them to negotiate. He'd tell Ukraine they would lose all military aid if they didn't comply, and he'd tell Russia that aid to Ukraine would be ramped up if the Russians did not negotiate. Ukraine has no choice. They cannot sustain the war effort without American aid, and so would certainly acquiesce to Trump's demand. Russia clearly has less incentives to negotiate, let alone in good faith to end the war. The war's momentum currently favors Russia, and they have an insurmountable advantage in sheer numbers of men and artillery shells, which Ukraine cannot match. And Ukraine may face a critical manpower shortage in less than a year. Ukraine already has a shortage of personnel, but by next summer this shortage could become a full-blown crisis. And though Russia is losing over 1,000 men a day, it is able to sustain this rate of loss longer than Ukraine can, and is now supplementing its troops with North Koreans. This means that Russia has the advantage in the short term. If they can keep up their current rate of advance and hinder American aid to Ukraine, they could launch a successful offensive that seizes a large amount of Ukrainian land. However, Putin outright denying Trump's efforts to negotiate would embarrass and likely enrage Trump, and Putin knows this. I think he will negotiate with Trump and Zelensky, but not in good faith. Putin will refuse any demand for a ceasefire to occur before negotiations. If negotiations proceed, Putin will likely try to stall them, in the hopes that a Republican-controlled Congress won't vote for more aid to Ukraine while negotiations are going on, allowing Russia to take more land. It is easy to see in this scenario how negotiations could break down. But for the sake of exploring this scenario, let's say the negotiations do succeed. Based on what we know Trump's team wants, the front line would become a demilitarized zone and be the de facto new border between Ukraine and Russia. European countries would send their own troops to patrol this border for 20 years, during which discussions on Ukraine's entry into NATO would be put on hold. It's also possible that these negotiations could see Ukraine trading whatever territory it still holds in Kursk Oblast for an equivalent amount of Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. Assuming the Russians and North Koreans don't retake Kursk in the beginning of 2025, with the 60,000 troops they assembled in the region, Putin could easily sell this as a major victory to the Russian people, as it would pretty much guarantee permanent Russian control over Crimea, the Donbass, and southern Ukraine. Much like how no one today supports South Korea crossing the Korean DMZ and liberating North Korea, no one in 2044 would support Ukraine crossing the European DMZ and liberating all of its lost territories. The world will likely see this outcome as a costly Russian victory, but also one that definitely represents a defeat for the West, showcasing the dysfunction and unreliability of the US and Europe when it comes to responding to aggressive actions from our adversaries. Iran, China, and North Korea would all be emboldened. A Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan, in my opinion, becomes extremely likely. Number 4. Ukraine develops nukes after a partial collapse. Due to reasons I just explained, Russia in this scenario stalls negotiations, believing it can use negotiations to hinder American aid to Ukraine, while simultaneously pressing its short-term advantage in manpower and artillery to seize a vast swath of eastern Ukraine. In this scenario, the Republican Party refuses to vote for additional military aid to Ukraine, despite Putin stalling the negotiations. As Russia advances, negotiations between Ukraine and Russia completely collapse. American military aid dries up, and Europe fails to increase their own aid to Ukraine. Ukraine, overwhelmed by Russia and North Korea's superior manpower and quantity of military equipment, start losing large amounts of land to Russia. Eventually, the Russian army captures Pavlograd and can now credibly threaten Ukrainian control over major cities such as Kharkiv and Zaporizhia. Ukraine now faces a choice: keep fighting as it has for the past few months and deal with a realistic chance of losing two of its largest cities, or develop nukes. If I were Zelensky, the choice would be obvious. If the West can't protect you, only nukes can. This is a course of action Zelensky apparently told Trump that Ukraine would be forced to take if Russia seemed like it would win the war, which, according to Zelensky, Trump said was a fair argument. And in a speech given in October, Zelensky stated that Ukraine would have to choose between NATO membership and developing nuclear weapons. By using radioactive waste that Ukraine has from its many nuclear energy facilities, the country could easily create what is known as a dirty bomb, and use it as a tactical nuclear weapon in combat. The goal of this kind of nuclear strike would not to be to gain an advantage in combat, but rather to terrify the Russian state into agreeing to a ceasefire. Such an action would lead the world into uncharted territory. A whole new range of potential scenarios open up. Most likely Russia would agree to a ceasefire rather than face nuclear annihilation. But it is easy to see how a full-scale nuclear war between Russia and Ukraine, and potentially the entire West, could easily happen in this scenario. Number 5. Frozen conflict. This is what I currently believe is the most likely way the war ends. In this scenario, despite Trump's best efforts, negotiations between Ukraine and Russia break down. The Russians resume or continue their offensive against Ukraine, but finally begin experiencing the critical shortages of manpower and military equipment that they are expected to suffer in 2025, which its ally North Korea is unable to make up for. Consequently, the Russians are only able to make minor inconsequential gains on the front lines. The most significant victory they could possibly achieve is taking the strategically located Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk and ejecting the Ukrainians from Kursk, but Russian forces are completely exhausted and depleted after doing so. In this scenario, Ukraine is able to at least partially deal with its own manpower crisis and eventually completely stop the Russian advances. Europe provides some level of increased aid to Ukraine, but not enough to decisively defeat Russia. Thanks to this increased aid, as well as improved drone technology, Ukraine is able to launch small offensives that push the front line back a few kilometers. At most, they are able to retake some towns on the front, but their manpower shortages prevent them from initiating a decisive offensive. The Russians and Ukrainians then fight each other along an unchanging front line for several months or even years, before eventually a ceasefire between the two is reached. No serious negotiations beyond that are even remotely successful, and the two sides engage in low-level skirmishes and artillery battles along the front line for years or even decades after the ceasefire is signed. In this timeline, I still think China would try something with Taiwan, because the West has demonstrated that we won't give the aid necessary to our allies to ensure a decisive victory. Russia will have taken 1/5 of Ukraine and basically be able to keep it long-term. Putin will be able to sell that as a victory. The West loves showing itself as too politically divided and isolationist to be able to protect democracies abroad when they are attacked by their autocratic neighbors. Once again, if China tries something with Taiwan, I think North Korea would do something to South Korea at the same time. If this happens a few years after a ceasefire in Ukraine, then almost certainly Russia would take the time to rebuild its military, and then launch another invasion of Ukraine. A third world war becomes extremely likely. These are 5 scenarios that I think have some possibility of happening under Trump's term, with some obviously being a lot less likely than others. Obviously, there's a much wider range of possibilities than the 5 presented here, but these are the 5 scenarios that are different from one another to warrant a discussion.